The words cut through the cabin like a blade. "You don't belong here." Danielle Carter looked up from her 3-month-old daughter Ava, who had been crying softly in her arms for the past 10 minutes. The flight attendant standing over her, a blonde woman with sharp features and a name tag reading Heather Lawson, wore an expression of barely concealed disgust. "Excuse me?" Danielle's voice remained steady, though her heart began to race. She adjusted baby Ava against her shoulder, the infant's cries echoing through the first-class cabin of Transair Flight 447 from New York to Los Angeles. Heather's eyes swept over Danielle's simple black dress, her natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and settled on the crying baby with obvious irritation. "I said, you don't belong here. This is first class, and your situation is disturbing our other passengers." Around them, the other first-class passengers, mostly white, mostly wealthy, turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Some pulled out their phones, sensing drama. Others simply stared, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Danielle felt the familiar sting of judgment, the weight of assumptions being made about her, based on nothing more than the color of her skin. But there was something else in her eyes, a calm confidence that suggested this woman had no idea who she was dealing with. You won't believe what happens next. 30 minutes earlier, Danielle had boarded the aircraft with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to luxury, but never taking it for granted. She wore no jewelry except for a simple wedding band and carried a designer diaper bag that looked expensive but understated. To the casual observer, she appeared to be just another young mother traveling with her baby. But appearances, as the saying goes, can be deceiving. Heather Lawson had noticed Danielle the moment she stepped into first class. As the senior flight attendant on Transair's flagship route, Heather prided herself on knowing who belonged in the premium cabin and who didn't. And in her 12 years of service, she had developed what she considered an infallible radar for passengers who were out of place. "Sarah," Heather whispered to her colleague, Sarah Mills, as they watched Danielle settle into seat 2A. "Did you check her ticket thoroughly?" Sarah, a newer flight attendant eager to please her senior colleague, nodded. "First class, paid in full, but—" She lowered her voice further. "You know how it is sometimes. Corporate upgrades, frequent flyer miles, that sort of thing." Heather's lips pursed. She had seen it before. People who clearly couldn't afford first class finding ways to sneak in, disrupting the atmosphere her regular passengers expected. The fact that this particular passenger was a young black woman with a crying baby only reinforced her suspicions. "Keep an eye on her," Heather instructed. "Make sure she's not causing any problems." As the plane prepared for departure, Heather made her rounds through the cabin, offering champagne and warm towels to the first-class passengers. But when she reached Danielle's row, her demeanor shifted subtly. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Heather asked, her tone professional but cold. Danielle looked up from trying to soothe Ava, who had begun to fuss as the cabin pressure changed. "Is there a problem?" "Just routine verification," Heather replied, though nothing about her expression suggested this was routine. She examined the boarding pass with exaggerated care, as if searching for evidence of fraud. Several passengers noticed the unusual scrutiny. An elderly white gentleman in 1B frowned at the obvious differential treatment. A businesswoman in 3A pulled out her phone and began recording, sensing that something was about to go very wrong. Danielle handed over her identification as well, her expression remaining neutral despite the obvious harassment. "Will that be all?" Heather studied the ID, Danielle Carter, Manhattan address, no obvious red flags. But her suspicion only deepened. In her experience, people like this didn't belong in first class unless something was amiss. "For now," Heather said, returning the documents with obvious reluctance. "But I'll need you to keep that baby quiet. Our first-class passengers pay premium prices for a peaceful flight experience. The implication was clear. Danielle was somehow less deserving of that same peaceful experience, despite holding the same ticket as everyone else. As Heather walked away, Danielle caught the eye of the businessman recording the interaction. He gave her a sympathetic nod, but she simply turned her attention back to Ava, her expression revealing nothing of the storm brewing beneath the surface. What none of them knew was that Danielle Carter had been dealing with assumptions and prejudices her entire life. She had learned long ago that the best response to ignorance was patience, and that sometimes the most powerful people were the ones who never felt the need to announce their power. The plane's engines roared to life, but the real turbulence was just beginning. As Flight 447 reached cruising altitude, Ava's cries intensified. Danielle rocked her gently, whispering soft reassurances, but the baby's discomfort from the cabin pressure was obvious to anyone with children of their own. Heather Lawson was not one of those people. "Mom!" Heather approached again, her voice carrying a sharp edge that cut through the cabin noise. "I'm going to need you to control your child immediately." Danielle looked up, her patience wearing thin but her voice remaining level. "She's 3 months old and experiencing pressure changes. I'm doing everything I can to comfort her." "Everything you can?" Heather's voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from nearby passengers. "Because what I see is a disruptive passenger who's ruining the flight experience for everyone else." The businessman in 3A looked up from his laptop, clearly disturbed by the flight attendant's tone. The elderly gentleman in 1B set down his newspaper with an audible rustle of disapproval. "Perhaps," Danielle said carefully, "you could suggest some techniques that have worked for other traveling families?" Heather's laugh was cold. "Other families know how to prepare for air travel appropriately. Other families don't bring screaming infants into first class unless they can afford private jets." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around them, passengers began to shift uncomfortably. Several were now openly recording the interaction on their phones. "Are you suggesting?" Danielle asked, her voice still controlled but with steel underneath, "that I somehow don't belong in first class?" "I'm suggesting," Heather replied, "that if you can't afford proper childcare arrangements, perhaps you should have chosen more appropriate accommodations." Sarah Mills appeared beside her supervisor, emboldened by Heather's aggressive stance. "We could help her move to an economy seat," she suggested loudly enough for other passengers to hear. "There might be more room for her situation. Back there." Danielle felt the familiar burn of humiliation and rage, but her expression never changed. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, checking something quickly before placing it face down on her tray table. "I appreciate the offer," she said quietly, "but I believe I'll stay exactly where I am." There was something in her tone, a quiet confidence that made Heather's eyes narrow with suspicion. This wasn't the response she expected from someone supposedly out of their depth. "We'll see about that," Heather muttered, but loud enough for Danielle to hear. "We'll just see about that." As she walked away, Heather began formulating a plan. In her experience, people like this could be intimidated into compliance. They just needed to understand the consequences of causing trouble on her aircraft. What Heather didn't notice was that Danielle had begun typing a message on her phone. A simple text that read, "Jonathan, I might need your help in about 10 minutes. The response came back almost immediately. "Everything okay? What do you need?" Danielle glanced around the cabin, noting the phone's recording, the uncomfortable expressions of her fellow passengers, and the smug satisfaction on Heather's face as she whispered with Sarah, "Just be available." She typed back, "Trust me." Outside the aircraft windows, clouds stretched endlessly beneath them, but inside the cabin, a storm was building that would soon change everything. The breaking point came when Ava's crying reached a crescendo during the meal service. Danielle had tried everything, feeding, burping, gentle rocking, walking the aisle. But the baby was simply having a difficult flight, as babies sometimes do. Heather appeared like a vulture circling its prey. "That's it," she announced loudly, her voice carrying to every corner of the first-class cabin. "I've received multiple complaints about the noise level, and I will not allow one passenger to ruin everyone else's travel experience." Danielle looked around the cabin. The elderly gentleman in 1B was shaking his head in disgust, but not at her. The businesswoman in 3A had her phone out, clearly live streaming. Even the couple in 5C, who had been sleeping through most of the flight, were now awake and watching with obvious disapproval of the flight attendant's behavior. "Multiple complaints?" Danielle asked calmly. "From whom?" "That's not your concern," Heather snapped. "What is your concern is the fact that you're about to be removed from this aircraft." Sarah Mills stepped forward, clearly enjoying the drama. "We have protocols for disruptive passengers," she added with barely concealed glee. "And we're not afraid to use them." "Disruptive." Danielle's voice remained steady, but there was an edge now that made several passengers lean forward. "I'm caring for my infant daughter. What exactly about that do you find disruptive?" Heather's mask finally slipped completely. "What I find disruptive," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "is people like you thinking you can just buy your way into spaces where you don't belong and then act like you own the place." The words hung in the air like a slap. Several passengers gasped audibly. The man recording from 3A whispered, "Holy shit," under his breath, not realizing his live stream was picking up every word. "People like me?" Danielle repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "You know exactly what I mean." Heather continued, apparently unable to stop herself now that she'd started. "Young mothers who clearly can't handle the responsibility of air travel, who think a first-class ticket gives them the right to disturb paying customers, who probably used some government assistance program to afford this seat in the first place." The racism was now so blatant that even the most oblivious passenger couldn't miss it. The elderly gentleman in 1B stood up. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Heather, "I am a paying customer, and I am far more disturbed by your behavior than by this mother caring for her child." "Sir, please return to your seat," Sarah Mills said nervously. "This doesn't concern you." "The hell it doesn't," the businessman from 3A called out, his live stream now showing over 3,000 viewers. "Lady, you need to check yourself. This is 2025, not 1955. But Heather was beyond reason now. "This woman," she said, pointing at Danielle, "is going to gather her belongings and move to economy, or she's going to be escorted off this aircraft at our next landing. Those are her only options." Danielle stood slowly, cradling Ava against her chest. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone in the cabin fall silent. "Before I do anything," she said, "I think I should make a phone call." "You don't get to make demands," Heather sneered. "You don't get to call anyone. You're getting off my aircraft." Danielle smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Your aircraft," she repeated softly. "That's interesting, because I'm pretty sure this is a Transair aircraft, and I'm pretty sure I know someone who might have some thoughts about how Transair passengers are being treated today." Something in her tone made Heather pause, but she was too deep in now to back down. "I don't care who you think you know," she said. "This is my cabin, and you're leaving it." Danielle reached for her phone, but Heather moved to block her. "Oh no," Heather said. "No phone calls, no delays. You're done here." The livestream viewer count had now reached 10,000 and climbing. Comments were flying faster than anyone could read them, but the general sentiment was clear. They were witnessing something historic unfold. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness something unprecedented. The confrontation escalated rapidly when Heather made the fatal mistake of physically blocking Danielle's access to her phone. "Remove your hand from my personal property," Danielle said, her voice carrying a new edge that made several passengers straighten in their seats. "Or what?" Heather challenged, her confidence still intact despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere around her. "You'll call your baby daddy to come rescue you." The racist implication was so blatant that even Sarah Mills looked uncomfortable, but Heather was past the point of no return, intoxicated by what she perceived as her own power. "Sarah, call the captain," Heather instructed. "Tell him we have an uncooperative passenger who needs to be restrained." "Restrained?" The elderly gentleman from 1B was now standing in the aisle. "For what crime? Caring for her child?" "Sir, return to your seat immediately," Heather barked, "or you'll be joining her in restraints." The businessman live streaming from 3A spoke up. "This is insane. Lady, you're discriminating against this woman in front of thousands of people. Do you have any idea what you're doing to your company's reputation right now?" Heather whirled around. "Turn off that camera immediately." "No," he replied firmly. "This is a public space, and you're a public employee. People have a right to see how you treat passengers." The viewer count had now exceeded 15,000, with comments flooding in from around the world. Transair discrimination was beginning to trend on social media platforms as viewers shared the live stream. Sarah Mills returned from the galley, looking nervous. "The captain is busy with flight operations. He said to handle it according to protocol." "Fine," Heather said. "Protocol it is." She reached for the cabin phone. "This is Flight Attendant Lawson requesting security to first class immediately. We have an aggressive passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions." Danielle remained perfectly calm throughout this exchange, simply holding Ava and watching Heather destroy her own career in real time. When Heather hung up the phone, Danielle spoke again. "Are you quite finished?" she asked politely. "I'm finished when you're off my aircraft," Heather replied. Danielle nodded thoughtfully. "Your aircraft. You keep saying that. It's almost like you think you own Transair." Something in her tone finally penetrated Heather's rage-fueled confidence. For the first time, she looked uncertain. I'm the senior flight attendant. This is my cabin." "Interesting perspective," Danielle mused. "I wonder what the actual owner would think about your management style." The businessman's live stream was now approaching 20,000 viewers. In the comments, people were beginning to research Transair's ownership structure, trying to understand Danielle's cryptic comments. 2 air marshals appeared in the first-class cabin, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. They looked around, clearly expecting to find some obvious threat, but instead saw a calm woman holding a baby and a flight attendant who appeared to be having some kind of breakdown. "What seems to be the problem here?" the senior marshal asked. Heather jumped at the chance to present her version of events. "This passenger is being disruptive, refusing to control her child, and becoming aggressive when asked to comply with airline regulations." The marshal looked at Danielle, who was standing quietly, gently bouncing Ava. "Ma'am, is this accurate?" "No," Danielle replied simply. "It is not." "She's lying," Heather interjected. "She's been causing problems since we took off." The marshal held up a hand for silence, then addressed the other passengers. "Can anyone else provide perspective on this situation?" The elderly gentleman immediately spoke up. "Officer, I've been flying for 40 years, and I've never seen a flight attendant treat a passenger with such disrespect. This young lady has done nothing wrong except try to care for her child." The businessman added, "I've been live streaming this whole thing. 23,000 people have watched this flight attendant harass this mother with what can only be described as racially motivated harassment." The marshal's expression grew serious. He looked back at Heather, who was beginning to realize that her version of events wasn't being supported by the witnesses. "Ma'am," he said to Danielle, "would you like to file a complaint against the flight crew?" Danielle considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "Not yet. First, I'd like to make that phone call I was trying to make earlier." Heather started to object, but the marshal cut her off. "Ma'am, you have every right to make a phone call." Danielle smiled and pulled out her phone. As she began to dial, she caught Heather's eye. "You know," she said conversationally, "I really think you should meet my husband. He's going to be very interested in your thoughts about who belongs on Transair aircraft." For the first time, Heather looked genuinely afraid. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Danielle, sweetheart, what's happening up there?" The cabin fell completely silent. Even baby Ava seemed to sense the tension, settling into quiet alertness in her mother's arms. "Hi, honey," Danielle said, her voice carrying clearly through the first-class cabin. "I'm having a slight issue with some of your employees. Could you patch me through to Captain Morris, please?" Heather's face had gone completely white. Sarah Mills looked like she might faint. "Your employees?" the senior air marshal repeated, his eyebrows rising. "Of course," came the voice from the phone, audible to everyone nearby. "Captain Morris, this is Jonathan Carter. My wife needs to speak with you immediately." The livestream viewer count had exploded past 50,000, with comments flying so fast they were impossible to read. But 3 words kept appearing over and over: CEO, owner, and holy shit. Captain Morris's voice came through the cabin speakers within seconds. "Mrs. Carter, I am profoundly sorry for whatever has occurred. How can I assist you?" The transformation in the cabin was immediate and dramatic. Heather Lawson looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Sarah Mills had actually grabbed onto a seat back for support. Even the air marshals straightened to attention. "Captain Morris," Danielle said calmly, still holding her phone but speaking towards the cabin speakers. "I'm calling to report that 2 members of your cabin crew have engaged in what I can only describe as racially motivated harassment of a passenger." "Ma'am?" Captain Morris replied immediately. "Can you please specify which crew members?" Danielle looked directly at Heather. "Flight attendants Heather Lawson and Sarah Mills have spent the past hour attempting to force me to leave first class, suggesting I don't belong here, implying I'm using government assistance to pay for my ticket, and physically preventing me from making this phone call." The silence in the cabin was deafening. "Mrs. Carter," Captain Morris said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "I want you to know that as of this moment, Ms. Lawson and Ms. Mills are suspended from duty. I will be conducting a full investigation, and I assure you that appropriate action will be taken." Heather finally found her voice. "You can't. I mean, this is impossible. I've worked for this airline for 12 years. Danielle looked at her, with something approaching pity. 12 years, she repeated. 12 years of treating passengers like this, and no one ever called you on it because they didn't have the power to do anything about it. The businessman's live stream had now reached over 100,000 viewers. Comments were pouring in from airline employees, civil rights advocates, and ordinary people expressing their shock and outrage at what they'd witnessed. "Jonathan," Danielle said into her phone, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about sensitivity training and hiring practices." "Absolutely," came the reply. "And Danielle, I love you. I'm proud of how you've handled this." "I love you too," she replied. "See you in Los Angeles." As she hung up, Danielle looked around the cabin at the faces staring back at her, some shocked, some admiring, some simply trying to process what they'd just witnessed. "Now then," she said to the air marshals, "about that complaint." Heather Lawson's career at Transair had just ended, but the ripple effects of this moment were only beginning. The collapse was swift and absolute. Within 15 minutes of Danielle's phone call, Captain Morris himself appeared in the first-class cabin, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of barely contained fury. "Ms. Lawson, Ms. Mills," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in aviation. "You are hereby removed from duty and will be escorted off this aircraft upon landing. Security will handle your removal from the premises." Heather tried one last desperate attempt at salvage. "Captain, you don't understand. She was being disruptive. Her baby was crying. The other passengers were complaining." "Ma'am," the elderly gentleman from 1B interrupted, "I am those other passengers, and the only complaint I have is about your behavior." The businessman from 3A, still live streaming to an audience that had grown to nearly 200,000 viewers, added, "Captain, I've recorded this entire incident. There was no disruption except from your flight attendants." Captain Morris nodded grimly. "The recording will be part of our investigation. Ms. Lawson, your actions today are not only a violation of company policy, but potentially criminal discrimination. Our legal department will be reviewing all options." Sarah Mills finally spoke up, her voice barely a whisper. "I was just following Heather's lead. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to discriminate against a passenger based on her race?" Captain Morris asked. "You didn't mean to attempt to forcibly remove a paying customer from a seat? You didn't mean to violate every principle of customer service and human decency that this airline stands for?" By this time, the live stream had been shared across multiple social media platforms. Transair discrimination was trending #1 worldwide. News outlets were picking up the story. The airline's stock price was beginning to fluctuate as investors processed the implications of the viral video. Heather made one final mistake. She turned to Danielle with venom in her eyes. "You think you've won something here? You think this changes anything? People like you will always be—" "That's enough." Captain Morris cut her off. "Security, please escort Ms. Lawson to the rear of the aircraft. She'll be met by authorities upon landing." As Heather was led away, her face a mask of rage and humiliation, Sarah Mills followed, tears streaming down her cheeks. The air marshals approached Danielle. "Mrs. Carter, would you like to press charges?" Danielle considered this carefully. "Let me consult with my husband and our legal team, but yes, I think there need to be consequences that extend beyond just employment termination." Captain Morris nodded. "Mrs. Carter, on behalf of Transair, I offer my deepest apologies. This behavior is absolutely unacceptable and does not represent our values." "Captain," Danielle replied, "I appreciate that. But we need to talk about systemic changes. This didn't happen in a vacuum. How many other passengers have been treated this way by these employees? How many didn't have the resources to fight back?" The live stream audience, now approaching 300,000 viewers, watched as one of the most powerful comebacks in internet history unfolded in real time. Within hours, Heather Lawson would be terminated and facing potential federal charges for civil rights violations. Sarah Mills would be fired and blacklisted from the airline industry. The entire incident would trigger a Department of Transportation investigation into discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. But the real impact was just beginning. 3 hours later, as Flight 447 descended toward Los Angeles, Danielle Carter sat in her first-class seat, finally enjoying the peaceful flight experience she had paid for. Ava slept soundly in her arms, oblivious to the history her mother had just made. The businessman from 3A, whose live stream had documented everything, approached her during the final descent. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I'm James Wilson, and I want you to know that what I witnessed today was extraordinary. Not just the revelation about your husband, but your grace under pressure. You never lost your composure, never raised your voice, never responded with the anger that would have been completely justified." Danielle smiled. "My grandmother used to tell me that dignity is something no one can take from you unless you give it away. I learned a long time ago that the most powerful response to ignorance is often patience." "But what about justice?" James asked. "What about accountability?" "Oh, there will be accountability," Danielle replied, her voice carrying quiet steel. "But it won't be about revenge. It will be about ensuring this never happens to another family." By the time they landed, the story had exploded across global media. CNN, BBC, Fox News, and every major outlet were covering what was being called the Transair incident. The hashtag Dear Transair discrimination had generated over 1 million tweets. The original live stream had been viewed by more than 2 million people. But Danielle wasn't interested in the viral fame. She was interested in systemic change. Within a week, Transair had announced a comprehensive review of all customer service protocols, mandatory bias training for all employees, and the establishment of a passenger rights ombudsman position, with Danielle Carter serving as the founding advisor. "This isn't about one flight attendant or one airline," Danielle explained in her first interview after the incident. "This is about a pattern of discrimination that happens to millions of people every day. The only difference is that this time it happened to someone who had the power to do something about it." The interviewer asked, "What do you want people to take away from this experience?" Danielle considered the question carefully. "I want them to know that your worth as a human being isn't determined by someone else's assumptions about you. Whether you're a CEO or a single mother working 2 jobs, you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And when you witness injustice, whether it's happening to you or someone else, you have the power to stand up and say, 'This is not acceptable.'" The incident led to congressional hearings on discrimination in the airline industry, new federal guidelines for passenger treatment, and a wave of policy changes across the aviation sector. But perhaps most importantly, it sparked millions of conversations about implicit bias, systemic discrimination, and the courage required to stand up for what's right. The story of Flight 447 didn't end when the plane touched down in Los Angeles. It became a catalyst for change that continues to ripple outward. But perhaps the most profound impact came in the weeks that followed, as the full scope of the incident's consequences unfolded across the nation. Heather Lawson's termination was just the beginning. Within 72 hours, the Department of Transportation launched a federal investigation into Transair's hiring and training practices. The FBI opened a civil rights case. State attorneys general from 12 states announced they were reviewing discriminatory practices across the airline industry. The live stream, which had been watched by over 5 million people within a week, sparked something unprecedented. Passengers began coming forward with their own stories. The hashtag #DarnAirlineWhileBlack exploded across social media as hundreds of travelers shared experiences of discrimination, humiliation, and abuse at the hands of airline personnel. Maria Rodriguez from Phoenix posted a video describing how she was forced to prove her immigration status, despite being a U.S. citizen. David Kim from Seattle shared security footage of being removed from first class, despite having a valid ticket. Jennifer Thompson from Atlanta revealed how flight attendants had suggested her crying infant probably had behavioral issues that needed professional intervention. The pattern was undeniable and damning. Jonathan Carter, CEO of Transair, didn't waste time with damage control or corporate spin. Instead, he did something revolutionary. He took full responsibility and announced immediate, sweeping changes. "What happened to my wife?" he said in a televised address. "Could happen to any person of color in America. The fact that she's married to me shouldn't matter. The fact that she had the power to fight back shouldn't matter. Every passenger deserves the dignity and respect that Danielle was denied." Transair became the first major airline to implement real-time bias reporting, where passengers could text incidents directly to corporate headquarters. They established a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, with immediate termination for first offenses. They partnered with civil rights organizations to completely overhaul their training programs. Most importantly, they hired Dr. Maya Johnson, a renowned expert in systemic racism, to conduct company-wide audits and implement lasting cultural change. But the impact extended far beyond one airline. American Airlines announced new sensitivity training requirements. Delta implemented passenger advocacy programs. United established bias incident response teams. Southwest created diversity and inclusion oversight committees. Congress held hearings. The FAA updated regulations. The Department of Justice launched a nationwide investigation into discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. Yet perhaps the most powerful change was happening at the grassroots level. James Wilson, the businessman who had live-streamed the entire incident, started a non-profit organization called Witnesses for Justice. The group trained ordinary citizens to safely document discrimination and provided legal support for victims of bias. The elderly gentleman from Seat 1B, revealed to be retired federal judge Robert Sterling, began speaking at conferences about the moral obligation to intervene when witnessing injustice. Even baby Ava, now a toddler, had become an unwitting symbol of change. Her mother often spoke about raising her daughter in a world where her first airplane flight had helped spark a movement toward equality. Danielle Carter herself had evolved from an inadvertent activist into a powerful advocate for systemic change. She testified before Congress, spoke at universities, and worked with Fortune 500 companies to address implicit bias in their organizations. "People ask me if I'm angry about what happened," she said during a keynote address at Harvard Business School. "And the truth is, yes, I'm furious, but not just about my experience. I'm angry about every person who has been diminished, dismissed, or dehumanized because of how they look, where they come from, or what someone assumes about their worth." The TransAir incident had exposed something uncomfortable about American society. Discrimination wasn't just happening in back alleys or behind closed doors. It was happening in broad daylight, in public spaces, captured on video for millions to see. But it also revealed something hopeful. When people witness injustice and choose to act, extraordinary change becomes possible. The viral video continued to be shared in diversity training sessions, university courses, and corporate workshops. It became a case study in business schools and law schools. It was referenced in Supreme Court briefs and congressional testimony. Most importantly, it changed behavior. Flight attendants across the country reported increased awareness of their own biases. Passengers became more willing to intervene when they witnessed discrimination. Airlines invested billions in cultural transformation initiatives. The ripple effects extended to hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and virtually every industry that served the public. The phrase, "We don't want another TransAir incident," became corporate shorthand for the consequences of tolerating discrimination. So the question now is, what will you do? The next time you witness discrimination, will you pull out your phone to record? Will you speak up for the person being targeted? Or will you look the other way and hope someone else handles it? The next time you see a young mother struggling with a crying baby, will you offer help or roll your eyes in annoyance? The next time you make assumptions about someone based on their appearance, their accent, or the color of their skin, will you challenge those assumptions or act on them? Danielle Carter had power, the power that comes with privilege and position. But the real power in that cabin came from ordinary passengers who refused to stay silent when they witnessed injustice. It came from James Wilson, who chose to record rather than look away. It came from the elderly gentleman who stood up and spoke out. It came from every person who watched that live stream and said, "This is not okay." You have that same power. Use it. Support businesses that promote equality. Hold companies accountable when they fall short. Speak up when you see discrimination. Record when it's safe to do so. Share stories that need to be heard. Download the Witnesses for Justice app. Join your local civil rights organization. Vote for leaders who will protect civil rights. Teach your children that dignity is non-negotiable. Because what happened on Flight 447 proved something profound. One moment of courage, one decision to stand up rather than stay silent, one choice to do what's right rather than what's easy, can change the world. Power isn't about the position you hold, it's about the principles you stand for. When we stand together, we all rise. and sometimes justice takes flight at 30,000 feet.